Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bassam Haddad, and I'm joined here by my friend Adam Horowitz, and we are speaking with our friend and colleague at Jadaliyya, Mouin Rabbani. This is a very sort of interesting and precarious time. We're speaking with Mouin at a time when Israel and the United States have already launched an aggressive, unprovoked, illegal war on Iran. So it will certainly make its way into our conversation about Israel's endgame. And we will be still talking about the major topics that you have heard before if you've been following this series. We've already spoken with Miko Peled, Diana Butu, and Muhammad Al-Kurd, and Ilan Pape. Mouin Rabbani and Adam Horowitz, ahlan wa sahlan. Welcome to this conversation.
Hi to both of you.
Hello.
Hello. So I will introduce Adam quickly this time as the managing editor of Mondoweiss, which you can and should be reading all the time at mondoweiss.com. And,
that works.
I
.net.
just want to make sure it's not something else. And he is also the co-host of this series on Israel's Endgame, and Mondoweiss is a co-sponsor of this series as well. Mouin Rabbani, as many of you who follow our broadcasts know, he is a researcher, analyst, and commentator specializing in Palestine or Palestinian affairs, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the contemporary Middle East. He served as the principal political affairs officer with the Office of the UN Special Envoy for Syria, head of Middle East with the Martti Ahtisaari Peace Foundation. Mouin, I suggest taking that line out of your bio because nobody knows how to pronounce it. And senior Middle East analyst and special advisor on Israel-Palestine with the International Crisis Group. Rabbani is co-editor of Jadaliyya, where he also hosts the Connection podcast, which is a prolific podcast on Jadaliyya and the Arab Studies Institute, and edits its Quick Thoughts feature. That is the Quick Thoughts feature on Jadaliyya. He's also managing editor and associate editor of the Journal of Peacebuilding and Development, and a contributing editor of Middle East Report, or was at Journal of Peacebuilding and Development. Now, I will also share with you that I'm not going to continue reading his bio. It's a long bio, but you can read it when this broadcasts posts on Jadaliyya. Mouin, as you know well, because you also participated in talking about this project as we were finalizing the concept note, Israel's endgame is not something that people just started thinking about. In fact, many people have actually been talking about it for some time at this point. Nonetheless, our first question to you will address whether Israel can sustain its policies of annihilation of all sorts, with the subset including its apartheid policies, its ethnic cleansing, dispossession, of course, all undergirded by a brutal military occupation, and now featuring the latest, which is its genocide in Gaza over the past 2.5 years. But before we get into this, we cannot ignore what is happening today, which is a continuation of the behavior we are addressing as part of Israel's policy that, is almost unfathomable that it can be sustained, and that is the war on Iran. Would you like to address this as, or before we delve into the topic more specifically, even though there's going to be a lot of overlap?
Well, there is a lot of overlap because I think when we speak about Israel's endgame, establishing its unchallenged hegemony over the entire region is very much part of Israel's endgame. And the elimination of Iran as a potential challenger to Israeli hegemony is part and parcel to that. Of course, making it easier for Israel to unilaterally resolve the question of Palestine on its own terms. in accordance with its own interests through the application of violence and power. And I think the other element of this is that Israel has managed to position itself quite effectively as the U.S. viceroy in the Middle East, and its ability to now succeed in this campaign against Iran will very much also, I think, have an impact on the future of the U.S.-Israeli relationship.
Um, Absolutely, and I'll come back to this as well as Adam will. But let me start with the question we ask our guests in the series at the outset, which is, can Israel sustain its policies indefinitely? The policies that I addressed, its reality,
Mhm.
its actual practice, and its almost never-ending expansionist, at least desires, if not the actual manifestation, which we are seeing in practice today in, of course, Lebanon, like actually today, where they where they told the Lebanese to clear more than 50 villages in southern Lebanon, in Syria, and of course, beyond, according to not just people like Huckabee, who are ideological zealots, but also Lapid, who is the supposed leader of the more, uh, liberal or
Great white hope
non-Likud.
of liberal Zionism.
Absolutely. So that's the essential question that we start with, and we'd like to hear
Mhm.
your take on that possibility before Adam picks it up with a follow up.
Well, I think one first has to ask whether Israel believes that this is sustainable, and there I think the answer is clearly yes. Israel believes that it has the wherewithal to be in permanent control of all of mandatory Palestine, and it believes that it does have the capacity to continue as the hegemonic power over the Middle East. And I think that's based on several factors. First of all, its overwhelming military advantage. Second of all, its belief that manpower is increasingly being replaced by technology, and that therefore Israel can overcome the disadvantages that it has in terms of human resources and so on. And the third is, of course, the relationship with the United States, which is that as long as the United States invests in Israel as its chief proxy in the Middle East, that Israel will be able to be kind of the force multiplier, if you will, of U.S. power in the region. That's how I think things look from Israel's perspective. But I think you also have to look at them from a more objective perspective, which is that on October 7th, for example, we learned very clearly that no amount of technology compensates for manpower, that Israel relied on cameras and automated machine guns and electronic fences to substitute for the kinds of military deployments that would have been required to contain Hamas and prevent the attacks that took place on that day. And of course, its excessive reliance on technology combined with hubris led for Israel to a catastrophic outcome. More broadly, Israel, in the larger scheme of things, it's a small state with a small population, with limited resources, that is entirely dependent, as we've seen very clearly in the past 2 years, on external support, militarily, primarily, of course, but also politically, and diplomatically and economically as well, because Israel, since Oslo, has become very well integrated into the global economy and is dependent on this global economy for its own economic well-being and progress. And here, I think, Israel has reasons to be worried. Part of it relates to the nature of its current regional project, which I think we'll talk about in a minute. But the second is that as Israel pursues this project with increasing intensity, it's essentially putting itself on a permanent war footing. And not only does it not have the resources for this, but there are two, let's say, counterproductive dynamics involved. The first is that many of those Israel needs most to sustain this project are opting out. We're beginning to see the beginning of a brain drain among important sectors of the Israeli population. In many cases, the people that Israel would most rely upon for this project. And the second is that, ironically, the more successful Israel is in its military terms, the more its external support is beginning to diminish. You can't just conduct a 2 year plus long live stream genocide without losing important sectors of public opinion in those countries that are most essential for your support. And we are now at a situation where, almost shockingly, I would say, for the first time in history, public opinion polls are showing not only a very substantial decrease in US public support for Israel, but that for the first time there is more support for the Palestinians than for the Israelis. And this should set alarm bells ringing left, right, and center. I mean, you already have a very substantial segment of the US Jewish community that is either indifferent to Israel in the sense that it doesn't consider Israel important to its own identity as Jews, the way that maybe the older generations saw, or that are applying the same liberal or progressive values that they, as a rule, apply to domestic issues and other foreign policy issues, no longer accepting the Israeli exception and beginning to apply those same values to Israel. And you now have what I would think for Israel is an even more alarming development is that support within a much more conservative and right wing constituency, and I'm thinking here about evangelical Christians, that even in that constituency, support is no longer automatic and guaranteed and is beginning to diminish. So I think you take all these dynamics together, and I don't think you can make the argument that just as the Zionist movement transferred its allegiance from London to Washington in the 1940s, it can now simply shift from Washington to Beijing and ensure itself for another century. I don't think that works this way. I think you have all these dynamics building and developing below the surface that are going to have very serious ramifications for not only for Israel, but even more importantly, for its endgame, for its regional project.
Yeah, no, that is all interesting. And we're going to be digging into all of those pieces, I think. But one of the things we've been doing in this series, and we are usually beginning with this, is defining what Israel's endgame is. And so far, this conversation has primarily focused on Palestine itself, but the events of these last few days has really given us this opportunity now to start to see what Israel's endgame might be looking like regionally.
Yes.
So I guess
Mhm.
my question for you, and you've alluded to this, and I really kind of want to dig into it a little bit more, and it's a bit of a two-part question, because first I would just ask you, what is Israel's endgame regionally? And another question that I have, and I'm sure many people watching this will have, especially again, given the events in Saturday with this joint US-Israeli attack, um, to what degree can Israel's endgame in the region be separated from the US endgame in the region? Are those one and
Mhm.
the same, or are those diverging in some ways?
Yeah, and as I understand your question, it's focused very much on the region rather than on the Israeli-Palestinian relationship.
Yes.
I think they're related, but also distinct, the U.S. and Israeli endgames, and I'll get to that in a moment. But just by way of context, um, Israel, as you know, was knocked sideways on October 7th, 2023. It lost its footing, it was in crisis, and so on. And if you look at its initial response, let's say for the first 4 to 6 months, it seemed to be a response that was governed primarily by revenge and bloodlust. Then, in the course of the middle of 2024, Israel appeared to be regaining its self confidence and went on the offensive against the self proclaimed axis of resistance. It had a very successful campaign against Hezbollah in Lebanon, a significantly less successful campaign against Ansarullah, the Houthis in Yemen, and then was extraordinarily fortunate with the ouster of the Assad regime in Syria at the end of 2025, or was it the end of 2024? I believe it was 25. No, 24. Sorry. Well, you tell me. um, and this is something that Netanyahu initially claimed credit for, incorrectly, I believe, but then decided to go for what Israel terms the head of the octopus, which is, of course, Iran. Now, from my perspective, Israel felt it was in a position and well placed to recreate, let's call it a 1967 moment, where through an overwhelming military victory, it could reshape the strategic environment in the region for the better part of a generation. But I think there's an important difference between 1967 and 2026. In 1967, Israel's objective was to militarily crush its adversaries, and in doing so, to deter them from having any illusions about attacking Israel ever again, or at least for a very long time. And even that only lasted for 6 years. And ironically, it was the overwhelming nature of Israel's military victory that unleashed the dynamic that led Egypt and Syria to launch their own offensive in October of 1973. But what Israel is doing now goes far beyond a campaign to crush and deter its adversaries and enemies. Rather, what Israel is seeking to do now is to become the geopolitical engineer of the entire Middle East. And I think Syria provides a very good example of this. Lebanon provides another. And Israel basically now wants to be the power that is successfully able, to dictate the political disposition within not only each of its neighbors, but even farther afield in countries such as Iran. This is a much bigger role than Israel presumed to play in the aftermath of 1967, and relates, I think, to my response to the previous question. It's much more difficult to do that when you are a little country like Israel. But of course, Israel, on the one hand, sees that it is doing so with the full and unconditional support of the United States. And the United States, at least for the present, sees Israel as kind of its regional policeman. But having said that, we also do need to understand that the U.S. may unconditionally support Israel when it comes to, for example, the Palestinians, which is not really a concern for the Americans. So they're happy to let Israel go its merry way in dealing with them. There is clearly a shared agenda, at least in inflicting a crushing military blow against Iran. Though what happens next, I don't think enjoys U.S.-Israeli consensus. I think, Syria here, I think, is also a very good example. Both the U.S. and Israel were quite happy to see the back of Assad, but once he was gone, the U.S. came out in support of a strong, or at least central government that was capable of exercising control over its territory, whereas Israel's agenda was clearly one of fragmentation, and of a central government that was too weak to control its territory. And here we end up again also talking about the influence, for example, of the US client regimes in the Gulf, who, having experienced the fallout of the disintegration of Iraq after the 2003 US invasion, don't want to have another source of regional instability on their doorstep, namely Syria. So I do think there are distinctions between the two, because the US does not want a region that is fragmented and polarized to the extent that Israel would like it to be, because this will then create conditions where the US begins to see that region as a national security challenge, and will get drawn back in and have to expend increasing resources to ensure its own core interests in that region. And at a time of growing economic competition with China, of estrangement between the United States and Europe, I mean, even between the United States and its immediate neighbor, Canada, I don't think the US is prepared to invest the incredible amount of resources on these challenges that it has in the past.
Mouin, you had said something about the absence of the likelihood of Israel switching patrons from the United States to China, and before addressing more directly the question of whether Israel can resolve its security issues without dealing or addressing the question of Palestine, we keep talking about the world as it is, and this is the way we should be speaking. But there is a movement, or there has been a movement for the past, I'm not sure how long, but certainly since the first decade of the 21st century, away from unilateralism, away from a unipolar world. And a lot of people have actually been very gung-ho, or very supportive, or very much convinced that unipolarity has fallen apart. I do not think so. It is moving in the direction of multipolarity. That is the the international state system. Now, this is a juncture, as we are observing, of local and international trouble that the U.S. is in.
Yes.
And if you trace other empires historically, but this is, of course, a unique case given all sorts of developments from technology to post-industrial world, and so on. So we can start talking about the coalescence of a potential new configuration. So in that context, how long would it be, as you see it, before we begin bringing in other players other than the United States and Israel, and Europe as a sideshow to the conversation, including China, with Russia always being sort of a wild card, perhaps, if you will. But are we unrealistic to start thinking that the balances of power locally in Palestine, Israel, regionally, and beyond might benefit from that kind of conversation?
Well, I think it's already happening. I mean, if you go back to the Cold War, regional states were aligned either with the United States, with the West, or with the Soviet Union. I mean, you even had countries like Saudi Arabia that didn't that severed diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union early on, and didn't resume them until the end of the Cold War. So I think Iran was for a while the only country in the region that had hostile relations with both superpowers. But you look at it now, and this became, I think, particularly clear at the beginning of the Ukraine war. You saw many states in the region have engaged in a process that I would call strategic diversification. um, so you take a country, for example, like the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia. Yes, their primary relationship is with the United States. They continue to view the United States as the ultimate guarantor of regime survival, of their security and their stability. Although I think that has now been severely challenged by the war on Iran, but that's a different discussion. But at the same time, um, their main economic relationships tend to be, not with the U.S. or Europe, but with China, which is the primary client for their energy exports. You take Saudi Arabia. For many years, its main partner in setting world oil prices and so on was Russia. And so you see this. You see that these states are forming coalitions or alliances or whatever you want to call them with different states in order to meet different policy objectives. Now, what I was saying earlier is, in Zionism was, of course, sponsored by Britain, first through the Balfour Declaration, then through the British Mandate. And in the 1940s, the Zionist movement took the decision to no longer accept the British policy of establishing what the first British governor of Jerusalem called the Jewish Ulster in the Middle East, the idea of a Jewish national home, essentially British protectorate, but explicitly put on the agenda an independent Jewish state in Palestine. And in order to promote that objective, the Zionist movement essentially transferred its allegiance from London to Washington. And the Biltmore Congress of 1942 was seen as kind of the emblematic event of this process. And now some people are suggesting, well, if the US is pivoting to Asia, and if the US is becoming a declining global power and all of that, I'm not saying I agree that it's declining or pivoting, but if that's how it is, well, then Israel can undertake a similar transfer of sponsorship, if you will, from Washington to Beijing. But I don't see that happening because, first of all, the Chinese don't have kind of the same motives for supporting Zionism in Israel that the British and the U.S. Has had. And secondly, the Chinese have very deep economic relations throughout the region, and they will do a much more conventional cost benefit analysis than the British or the Americans have done. Now, does this mean that China will be hostile to Israel? No, I'm not suggesting that. It sees probably Israel as a significant technological partner, and perhaps in other ways. But the idea that Israel will find a sponsor similarly devoted to its regional supremacy, the way that its Western sponsors have been during the past century, I don't see that happening.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Bassam, did you have a follow up?
Um, just just to confirm this, the question of uh, Israel's security in the absence of dealing with the Palestinian question is, are we at a time today, since quite a bit of this series also speaks to the incredulity of what has been happening and how it stands to be the case for some time at least. Are we at a time when we can envision something without something that is more akin to the kinds of vision that we all aspire to, visions of equality and liberation? Are we as unrealistic to envision this more than, say, we would have been able to 2 decades ago?
No,
Yeah, go ahead.
no, I don't think so at all. I mean, I think, many people will make the argument, well, in the aftermath of the Gaza genocide, which hasn't even come to an end yet, um, given the acceleration of annexationist Israeli policies in the West Bank, given the unconditional US support and the at least passive acquiescence of much of Europe and everything that Israel has been doing, we are now much further away from the goals of Palestinian freedom and liberation and of Israeli Palestinian coexistence than we were 10 years ago. That's certainly one way to look at it, and you can point to factors to substantiate that point of view. Another way to look at it is you also need to look at the fundamental political transformations that have taken place, particularly during the past 2 years, although I think it started significantly earlier, and see that Israel has become a losing proposition in the West, that it has definitively and irreversibly lost the public square in the West, and that this is already beginning to have political consequences, and that these political consequences are not only going to grow, but are probably going to begin snowballing within the next few years. I mean, you now have the phenomena of candidates for the US Congress publicly distancing themselves from APAC, um, uh, not out of principle, but in order to win elections. It's the exact opposite of what used to be the case, which is where you would hold your nose and embrace APAC because you wanted to win elections. So, all these, of course, are all these congressmen distancing themselves, or congressional candidates distancing themselves from APAC, worth a single F-35? No, they're not. But in the not too distant future, these are people who will be voting on the next U.S. Foreign assistance bill. So my own view is that this is a fundamentally political struggle, and if you only look at its military aspects, or you only look at the public opinion aspects or the economic aspects, you're going to lose sight that in the end of the day, it's not who has the most powerful bombs, but it's going to be decided in the political arena. And in that arena, I think it's fair to say we're making very significant progress, and are arguably closer than we have been for a very long time.
Okay, just before giving it back to Adam, just because you mentioned it, and I was planning on asking about this because we ask everyone, public opinion is shifting, and you mentioned for the first time, based on the poll that just came out, the sympathy for Palestinians
That
exceeded
was a
sympathy for
Gallup poll, I think.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and
So it's
even
the
though
you know it's a
it's
gold
in double
standard.
digits, but it's under 20% differential, but it's significant considering the entire gap that has been covered. To what extent do you think this sort of change in public opinion has an impact on our conversation today, on the behavior of the state of Israel, on the mindset of Israeli leaders as well as Israeli society, because as we've also been sharing with others, it seems like a little while ago, like within the next year and a half, as people became sort of repulsed by Israel's killing barbarity, to be brief, it seems like the Israeli political class at least appeared not to longer care, or feel that even if they care, there's not much they can do, so they're just going on, continuing to go all out, while on the, if you will, on the side, supporting efforts to sway public opinion via the purchasing of networks and social media platforms. And we just had another development recently regarding CNN and beyond. How would you address the question of public opinion shifting in regards to our topic?
I think it's massively important, and I would compare it to the writing on the wall. It's not going to have an impact this year or next year, or at least not a significant impact. And I think we have to recognize that we live in a world where the chasm between ruler and ruled, that gap has significantly widened in the past few decades. And therefore, shifts in public opinion are going to work their way through the plutocracy, if you will, at a probably at a significantly slower pace than they would have in the 1960s or 1970s. But I do think that these changes are definitive and irreversible. I don't imagine that in the next 5 years, barring extreme circumstances, we're going to see a Gallup poll which shows that Israel has twice as much public support in the U.S. As do the Palestinians, for example. Those days are gone, and those days are gone forever. And at the same time, these political implications are not self-implementing. The speed and extent to which they will be implemented is also very much up to us, and how we can formulate and implement smart strategies that accelerate and maximize their impact.
Yeah, I mean, one of the conversations that we're having at Mondoweiss often is, at this point, this shift is undeniable. It's documented, it's clear, but shifting public opinion into political power is a whole nother question and a whole nother challenge, which I know is something you're speaking to. Just one of the other elements I would say about the polling, which also speaks to your point, is the generational quality of it. That, like,
Yes.
not only are the overall numbers shifting, but when you look at the 18 to 35-year-olds, it's even more overwhelming. So I think that point definitely stands. And I guess then my question, and I feel like maybe we're talking a little bit more about the US than we have in other conversations, but obviously the relationship is so important. So given both like the polling that we were just talking about, but then also that geopolitical picture you were painting earlier, we start this conversation by saying, can Israel afford to continue these policies? I guess my question is, can the US afford to continue its unconditional support for Israel, despite these potentially tectonic shifts that are happening both within public opinion, but also geopolitically?
Well, I think, so long as
And
the
I'm
U.S.
sorry, just to say, like, in terms of that scenario of Israel moving from Washington to Beijing, is there a version of this where Washington moves on from Israel?
Um, Again, just to be clear, I wasn't speaking. I
Yeah.
wasn't endorsing the theory that Israel could
Right,
move
right, right,
from.
right.
I just don't see that happening. In terms of your question, yes, as long as you have a government in Washington that is fully committed to Israel, it will find the resources and the political will to unconditionally support Israel. I don't think the United States, or at least at present and in the foreseeable future, is going to suffer from the kinds of challenges of resources and so on that it can do whatever it wants. I think Israel's problem with U.S. support is not that the U.S. will wake up one day, look at its bank balance, if you will, and realize it doesn't have either the funds or the inventory or whatever to support Israel, but that politicians in Washington will do a cost benefit analysis, whether in terms of U.S. electoral politics or in terms of a changed strategic environment in the Middle East, and conclude, that on the basis of a cost-benefit analysis, full, uncritical, unconditional support no longer makes sense, and that certain restraints are going to have to be placed on Israel. And once you get into that, you have effectively unleashed a whole dynamic where suddenly it becomes acceptable to deal with Israel according to the same standards that every other recipient of US foreign assistance is dealt with. That you can criticize Israel the same way, you would criticize Denmark or Argentina or whatever. And that, I think, creates a whole new dynamic. But at least for the time being, I think you look at it from Washington's perspective, Israel seems to be serving a U.S. strategic purpose. There haven't been any major costs associated with it. I was reading an analysis yesterday. I unfortunately can't remember who the author was, but this person was saying, trying to explain why Trump decided to attack Iran. And they said, well, look at it from his point of view. During his first term, he was told that if he recognized Israel's claims of sovereignty over Jerusalem, that this would set the entire Middle East alight. He neglected the so-called expert advice that he was getting. He rejected it or ignored it, and he didn't pay a price. In the second term, he was warned about going the attack on Venezuela, saying it would create serious challenges throughout Latin America. He went, abducted Maduro, no consequences. The same with Iran in June. So he's almost been conditioned. Remember, we're basically dealing with an empty vessel here. He's almost been conditioned to think he can do whatever he wants and there are never going to be any consequences. Well, I think in this case, he's going to find out, he's going to run into a reality that hasn't been an impediment before. But it's, people who were able to repeatedly conduct these kinds of activities without suffering the consequences for doing so tend to develop a habit of going farther every time. And in the case of the question you asked, I think it's only once the U.S. becomes confronted with challenges for its unconditional support for Israel, whether in the form of lost elections or in the form of growing opposition within the region or whatever, that we'll begin to see a change.
Predictions about the future, and we've seen already so much over just these last couple of days that it's impossible to do so. It does seem, though, already that the challenges that the U.S. and Israel are experiencing in Iran are more and different than that they were maybe anticipating on Friday, so to speak.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I may have missed the first part of your question.
No.
Or were you
It wasn't a question.
or were you just offering an opinion?
Yeah, no, I was just offering an opinion. But
No,
if I
I
can,
fully agree.
yeah.
I,
If, Bassam, if I can ask another question.
is it about the? Because I want to say something about the polling and
Oh, please
politics.
do.
Is that okay? Or
Yeah,
did
yeah.
you wanted to switch? Okay.
Yeah, I was going to
So,
move on, but let's stay there.
well, yeah, quickly. So, Mu'in, a lot of people would like to know whether we are in a situation where in 2028, potentially, this shift to a democratic sort of administration in the United States, which we usually say it's just two faces of the same coin. Do you think we can still say this after these polls about where Democrats have been heading as a voting bloc, and where Democratic politicians are becoming increasingly, almost by the month, concerned about money from APAC and being or seeming subservient to Israel? Do you think 2028 will be business as usual if a Democratic administration, which now looks likely, we don't know? And I ask you this as a member, somebody who lives in our potential 51st state, Canada.
Well, I think it depends on multiple factors. First of all, will there be elections in 2028? Um, if there will be elections, will the Democratic candidate be basically nominated by the party establishment, or will it be someone who is not part and parcel of that establishment? And I think, I do think that the Democrats now have this secret report on their desk pointing out that their decision to go out of their way to visibly show contempt to not only Arab American constituents and Muslim American constituents, but to their anti genocide constituents, to show contempt precisely because they were told it was a winning strategy. They now know that that backfired spectacularly. And I do think they'll be a lot more careful the next time around, assuming that they do indeed win the next elections. And I think a key indicator will be to see how they perform in the midterm elections. Will these type of, let's call them insurgent candidates or whatever, will they perform well in the midterm elections later this year, or will it be the more establishment type candidates that perform best? And if they perform well, will they prove influential in influencing the party's agenda, not only in Congress, but more broadly within the United States, or not? And those, I think, will provide important indicators of where the party will be headed, both in terms of its electoral platform and in terms of how it governs if it should win.
Thanks, Moeen. Very quick question. Sorry, Adam. Is this is this a Lebanese cedar tree behind you?
That one?
Yeah.
No, it's a Palestinian house key in wood.
لك شو هاوسكي. This is a cedar tree. هيدا من عنا.
لا ما فشرت.
فكرتك سيكلت لبنيز. طيب خلص. Sorry Adam. I just couldn't help it.
No, I saw you looking. Trying to figure it out. I wanted to shift the conversation slightly because, yeah, we have been talking regionally, and a lot of this series so far has really been focused on events in Palestine. And so, just to say, on the eve of this, the war on Iran that the U.S. and Israel were carrying out last week, just Bassam and I were talking about, Israel is deepening the threats or de facto annexation of the West Bank, everything that we're seeing play out in Gaza with Trump's board of peace, and the plans,
Yes.
which really felt like the end game in Palestine. And so I'm wondering, and you've alluded to this throughout, but I kind of want to make it clear for everyone listening and watching, just how is what we're seeing in Iran related to what we're seeing in Palestine? Are they how are they connected ultimately? And is there a scenario in which Israel has perhaps taken its eye off the ball in terms of in Palestine and now is getting distracted in Iran? Is it one cohesive project, or are they different, maybe even competing efforts?
And the
I
extent
think
to which
there.
the Iran war is
Yeah.
serving as some sort of a cover for what Israel is currently doing in Gaza, which includes a
Yes.
more full blockade and further escalation of violence, deadly violence.
I I think from Israel's perspective, they're different components of the same project rather than competing projects, if you will. I think for Israel, ensuring regional hegemony, or at the very least, ensuring that it has no adversary in the region that can successfully challenge it or threaten it, irrespective of what it does, is key to its ability to unilaterally resolve the core elements of the question of Palestine on the basis of its on the basis of the overwhelming power disparity between Israel and the Palestinians. So, in other words, it doesn't have to worry about what Egypt might do if it, you know, takes over the entire Gaza Strip. It doesn't have to worry about what Jordan might do if it annexes the West Bank. It doesn't have to worry about what Hezbollah might do if it expands its buffer zone in southern Lebanon, and so on. And from Israel's perspective, it sees Iran as the last remaining impediment to this project. Although, interestingly enough, senior Israeli politicians are now already beginning to talk about, well, once we're done with the Iranians, Turkey's next. Although I see that as a very far off and unlikely scenario. But Israel's core interest is, of course, in the territory it actually controls, which is Israel and the occupied territories, and it has a clear objective with respect to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The old mantra of maximum land with minimal Arabs, and what it has been doing in the past few years in terms of normalizing relations with various Arab states and so on is to de-link the Arab-Israeli conflict from the question of Palestine. I mean, it made peace with Egypt without relinquishing the occupied territories. It made peace with Jordan the same. I mean, it even signed the elements of a peace treaty with the PLO without relinquishing the occupied territories. So in Oslo, and so Israel's main objective is to ensure that it has no serious rival in the region, and that its relations with the region can proceed while it at the same time continues with the annexation of Palestinian territory.
Yeah, no, thank you for that.
Yeah. Um, did you want to follow up, Adam, and then I'll chime in. Did you want to follow
I
up?
didn't really have a follow up. I did not really have a follow up for that question. I am curious to return to, at the very beginning, you kind of you talk some about some of the obstacles to Israel carrying out this endgame, and one of the ones that you talked about that we've gone into is the issue of public opinion. But you also mentioned the issue of a brain drain or general, I would say,
Mm.
emigration from Israel. And I was wondering if you could say some more about that and how that is actually impacting or perhaps preventing Israel from accomplishing this endgame.
Well, I mean, I also don't want to exaggerate it, but we now have figures showing that over the past several years, not only have more Israelis been departing Israel than immigrating, so more emigrants than immigrants, but the disparity is increasingly large. And those who are leaving tend to be the better educated, They tend to be kind of people who can contribute more to Israel's economic growth, its technological progress, and so on. And I would argue they also tend to be the kind of people who public opinion in Western countries could more readily identify with and see as a reason to continue supporting Israel. And so I think this is over time uh, a significant challenge for Israel because ever since Oslo, it has become very deeply integrated into the global economy. Um, it's technology companies and arms sales and so on. It's really much more dependent on foreign economic relations than it was, let's say, in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And so when you begin losing people who who are essential to your ability to succeed in this economic environment. Again, most of them are not leaving, but a growing number are. That forms a real challenge, particularly also because many people expect that Israel is heading, it's already become a very extreme society, but it's expected to get even more nationalist and even more messianic in the years ahead. And that in turn will potentially accelerate this dynamic.
Um, I want to take advantage of having you with us, Mouin, because you've been speaking quite a bit for some time since I started reading you when I was a younger person in the 1990s, and you were
When
already.
you were a kid and I was a senior citizen.
I just found out that the number of years is not huge. So I'm gonna give you two or three scenes, and if you can help us make sense of it in terms of what is happening in and to Palestine. Okay, so scene number one: most of the all Arab Gulf states, and of course, Akid, Jordan and Egypt, were on the road, on a particular road, and have been, that was viewed as, by people who seek the liberation of Palestine, that was viewed as problematic vis-a-vis Palestine before October 7th. And then after, so that's one scene, right? With the couple of outliers, Arab outliers that are no longer significant at this point. After October 7th, we saw Saudi Arabia having cold feet and making statements about not wanting to be part of the Abraham Accords anymore until a Palestinian state is in view, and so on and so forth. So that's scene number two. Actually, there are four scenes. So scene number three, we began to see in the past few months either talk of or a reality of some pairings. On the one hand, UAE and Israel seem to be much closer to one another, and Saudi Arabia and Turkey beginning to we began to see sort of talk of Saudi Arabia and Turkey sort of forming another potential front, however temporary, right? And now the last scene we are witnessing today is all of these countries, including Turkey, as the maverick figure of Turkey announced recently, the opposition to Iran's retaliation to a war that is unprovoked and illegal against it. So it's Turkey, UAE, Saudi Arabia, all the other Gulf states, and of course Jordan, Taman, on one side with Israel and the United States, with Iran on the other, and of course Palestine is definitely not in that large group. So how would you make sense of these five scenes? What is temporary? What is enduring? And how does this bode for Palestine or Palestinian liberation? I could have sent this as a graph, but
I think it's very difficult to answer that with any confidence. What I do think is the case is that states, as a rule, don't like the idea of there being any hegemonic power in the region because it reduces their room for maneuver. It reduces their autonomy, independence, however you want to call it. And Saudi Arabia and many other states in the region, which previously saw Iran as their main regional rival, now see it as a significantly weakening power and are therefore beginning to view Israel as the main threat to regional stability for a number of reasons. I mean, you were earlier asking me about unconditional U.S. support for Israel. Well, when Israel can bomb a close U.S. ally like Qatar, it's different than bombing Syria or Yemen. Here you had the U.S. essentially authorizing one client state to bomb another, and apart from having to give apology, Netanyahu having to give an apology during the photo op, there were zero consequences for doing so. And so I think, it's not so much opposition to Israel as opposition to any regional hegemon. They don't want Iran dominating the region. They don't want Israel dominating the region. They don't want Turkey dominating the region. They want to have that autonomy and independence. And I think that is kind of a enduring priority. I think the other enduring consequence of the past 2 years is that the price of admission to the Abraham Accords has been raised significantly. I mean, when Saudi Arabia says that it requires, credible, time-bound, and irreversible progress towards a Palestinian state in order to normalize relations with Israel, I tend to believe they're serious about that because they're scared of the consequences of not doing so. In the case of the UAE, we've seen that, and of course of Jordan and Egypt, once you cross the threshold of normalizing with Israel, there's virtually nothing Israel can do that will cause these governments to reverse their decision. I'm not sure that's an answer to your question, but it's the best I can do.
It's horrible. It's really not. No, I'm joking. لا طبعا I've asked you this because I also want to put things on the table as they have been developing, at least in terms of our perceptions, right? Like the Turkey, Saudi Arabia not rapprochement, but sort of newfound,
Love.
potential union, yeah, is real, but we don't know how real it is. The animosity
Well,
between
it's a
Saudi,
convergence of interests.
yes, yes, and but also it's spurred by structural developments regarding how Israel and the UAE are doing their bidding in Africa, the Horn of Africa, in Somalia and Libya and so on. And there's a lot going on to make us think that these things are somewhat enduring. At the same time that in the presence of another sort of danger, the UAE, as we have seen of late, again, will actually be chummy with Saudi Arabia. The point is that, in my view, the structural things that have caused these rifts are going to re-emerge in the absence of a major catastrophe or potential catastrophe like the one we are seeing. Now,
I mean, sorry to interrupt you, but you've seen the Saudi Emirati rift has been laid aside during during this war against Iran, and
that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
But once it's over, I expect it will reemerge.
Exactly. Now, I will leave you. I will leave Adam with the last question. But if you don't mind, Mouin, bringing out your crystal ball, and quickly, you don't have to, and share with us what would be the outcome of this current war on Iran that would actually open the door to a more a future without a significant domination of US and Israel in the region, which is which is the catastrophe of all catastrophes, given the history of U.S. support for horrendous regimes for the past eight decades in the region,
Yeah.
whether Arab or Israel, and having in mind the kind of blunders that the U.S. has already committed in this particular war, and the kind of fortunes that it has sort of faced, whether in terms of its bases, whether in terms of its aircrafts, and whether in terms of the trust that many Gulf countries are now reconsidering in the United States, given that it wasn't able to support their bases, which were there presumably to defend them. And then also in the case of Israel, that became or appeared to be vulnerable several months ago, so much so that it had to sort of support a ending of the war because it couldn't sustain more than 12 days. And now we might see a recurrence despite the ganging up of both countries. So with that in mind, what would be a scenario that actually bodes well for any form of liberation for Palestine going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question and also a very difficult one to answer. Look, I think,
difficult.
but I think it's quite clear to anyone observing this that that Arab national security and the national security of all these states hosting U.S. bases has not been served well. Has not been served well by the U.S. presence, because if the U.S. was in any way concerned about their national security, it certainly wouldn't expose their territory to the attack it has been exposed to by launching this war against Iran. That's number one. But I don't really see, U.S. forces being asked to leave Kuwait or Qatar or whatever at the end. I think what matters is for the U.S. to believe that this is a failed adventure, and that the costs of this adventure have far exceeded any potential benefit, and that it was in significant part its commitment to Israel's agenda that led it to do so. Look, I'm not a military analyst. I don't know what's actually happening on the ground. For all I know, this war could end with a decisive U.S.-Israeli victory in the next 12 hours. For all I know, it could go on for another couple of weeks or months. But I am old enough to remember that in Iraq, the U.S.'s problems really began after Bush declared mission accomplished. Getting a decisive victory turned out to be the easy part, and then all hell broke loose. So I think the key issue is that the U.S. has to be confronted with a very visible demonstration of costs exceeding benefits, and of the region itself understanding that it has been pushed into disaster by the U.S. and Israel, and drawing the appropriate conclusions. Will it do so in the short term? I'm not sure. I'm optimistic on that score.
Adam, you signaled that you might have a question. Are you frozen? Is he frozen? He is frozen.
I think so, yeah.
Or he's just shocked.
Either frozen or doing a very good imitation of being frozen.
لا, he's shocked about your answer. طيب. Okay, well, we'll end there. And it does seem like he's with us, which is good. Mouin, thank you so much. I have been wanting to speak with you about regional matters. We discussed quite a bit here, but hopefully we will do another call about regional matters. And I got a thank you, Mouin, from Adam via text.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone watching. We have another at least 2 interviews. Actually, we have 3. One coming up with Noura علاقات. Okay. One with Shir Haver. And we also have one coming up with Abdul Jawad Omar from Al Shabaka, who lives in Palestine actually. So thank you all. Thanks, Mouin, so much for your
Thank
kindness
you.
and generosity. And take care, everybody. Salam. All right.
Are you done?